Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make moist and tangy Swedish meatballs. I start off by making a panad, which will keep the meatballs moist. I combine a half cup of breadcrumbs, a half cup of whole milk, a half teaspoon of salt, a quarter teaspoon of nutmeg, a quarter teaspoon of allspice, a half teaspoon of fresh cracked black pepper, and 1 teaspoon of minced garlic. Then I mix this together well and let it sit for at least 15 minutes for the starch in the breadcrumbs to absorb the liquid. This panade is going to add moisture to the meatballs because the liquid and starch form a gel that coats the proteins and it doesn't melt out of the meatballs like the fat will. While the panade is resting, I small dice half of a yellow onion and add a tablespoon of butter to a pan over high heat. Once the butter is melted, I add the diced onion into the pan. I cook the onion over high heat to caramelize it because it develops a really sweet and nutty flavor that complements the nutmeg and allspice seasonings. Once the onion is really nice and caramelized with a brown edge, I remove it from the heat and add it to the panade. You can already see how much liquid the breadcrumbs have soaked up just while the onion was cooking. I stir the onions in before adding in the meat. I place the pan I cooked the onions in to the side because I'll use the same pan to sear the meatballs and to make the sauce. Now I add my ground meat to the bowl. I use a combination of beef and pork. I'm using pork with 20% fat and beef with 15% fat. I add just over a pound of ground beef and about half a pound of ground pork. I mix the meat and the panade together until it's consistent and evenly distributed. I am trying not to overwork the meat too much though, because the protein molecules get released during mixing and those act as a glue. This glue-like substance can make the meatballs dense and chewy. Once I'm done mixing, I'll shape the meatballs. I use a scooper that holds 3 tablespoons to shape the meatballs. I scoop the meat out and drop it into my hand. I loosely roll it in my hand to form a nice ball shape and then set it on a baking tray. I normally get about 16 meatballs from this recipe. Then I use the same pan that I had previously cooked my onions in to sear the meatballs. If needed, add a little bit more butter to the bottom of the pan so that the meatballs won't stick. I sear 8 meatballs at a time over high heat. I sear the meatballs for 1.5 to 2 minutes and then flip them over and sear the other side for the same amount of time. Then I remove them from the pan and set them on a wire rack. After the first batch is done, I sear the second batch before cooking these in the oven. I cook the meatballs in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 14 minutes. The internal temperature should read 165 degrees Fahrenheit at a minimum when these are done. While the meatballs are cooking, I start making the sauce. I use the same pan that I used to sear the meatballs so that we have really flavorful fond in the bottom. I melt 4 tablespoons of butter over medium heat and then add a half teaspoon of mustard powder and 3 tablespoons of flour. I whisk all of this together and let it cook for about a minute, and then I add in 2 cups of broth. I prefer to use 1 cup of beef broth and 1 cup of veggie broth. I whisk this in with the roux of flour and butter that we just made so that it's not burning on the bottom of the pan. Then I add 1 tablespoon of soy sauce and 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce. I whisk this in together too. If you use low sodium soy sauce, you'll need to add a little bit more salt to the sauce later. Next I add 1 tablespoon of Dijon mustard, whisk this in, and bring the sauce to a simmer. Once the sauce is simmering, I add in 1 cup of heavy cream. I whisk this together too, and then I add in 2 tablespoons of sour cream. The sour cream adds a really nice tangy flavor to the sauce. I give a final whisk for the sour cream to make sure it's nice and incorporated, and then I add the meatballs into the sauce. Once all the meatballs are in the sauce, I stir everything together and make sure that the meatballs are well coated. There will be more sauce than there are meatballs, and that's okay because you want the sauce to cover whatever you're serving your meatballs with. In this case, I made some fresh noodles, so this acted as a pasta sauce. These also go great over fresh mashed potatoes. Keep the pan over low heat until you serve the meatballs. I like to plate the meatballs first and then pour some sauce over the noodles. Thanks for watching this video on how to make Swedish meatballs. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.